In nations across the world where we find ourselves looking at the magnificent buildings of an old medieval castle or an old medieval cathedral, very rarely do we find ourselves looking at these two buildings in the same locations. They tend to be almost exclusive of each other. One town or cityscape might have an ever-present and dominant medieval castle sitting atop of a motte, the mound, or sitting on a cliff top. In other places, we find the cathedral, sometimes the tallest building in that particular town or city. But one very rare occasion where we do find two of these magnificent medieval examples is the city of Rochester in the county of Kent in England. Now, not only do these two great, magnificent medieval buildings sit within the same cityscape, but it's practically, roughly about 100 meters apart from each other. So one can finish up a visitation of Rochester Cathedral and then hop across the road and visit the grand medieval castle and have a look around, all in just a single day. Now, I've taken a look at Rochester Cathedral before in a couple of previous videos, more looking at the 8 significant characters of that time. So today's video is going to be looking at the castle itself, the medieval sieges that have happened, how it was built, its design, and of course, its very long and interesting, intricate history. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. Now, in order to concisely talk about Rochester Castle's near 1,000-year history, we shall take it in 4 separate key points. The first 3 being the 3 major sieges at the castle, and then the 4th and final point will be about all of its history condensed from about 1500 to the present day. Now, being a near 1,000-year-old castle, there are many things that have changed both sort of defensively, architecturally, and of course in its entire purpose as a building, as a structure. So whilst I may be able to explain certain aspects of the castle's history and show you some interesting images of the now ruined Rochester Castle, there are certain things which have been lost over the past 1,000 years. So a little bit of imagination perhaps is required in certain contexts. Like with most castles built by the Normans, Rochester Castle started its life as a timber-framed structure, presumably built in the year 1067, very soon after the Norman conquest and the Battle of Hastings in the year 1066. It had all the classic architectural features and design defences as well. It was a motte and bailey with a moat surrounding it as well. But what it also had was the advantage of being situated next to the River Medway, wherein any attacking force coming via the river or via the North Sea English Channel areas would be met with an imposing cliffside, then an extended wall, then even further up to the Rochester Castle Keep. In the first 10 years of Norman rule in Rochester, well, it was a pretty bad situation because the Earl of Kent, Odo of Bayeux, half-brother to William the Conqueror, basically took it upon himself to reap the rewards and the spoils of the land and basically defraud the crown. Being put on trial in 1076, he was then exiled. and the lands given to the bishops of Rochester and more safer hands. That was until the year 1087, when, just days and weeks before his own eventual death, William the Conqueror was convinced by his eldest son Robert to reprieve and forgive Odo of Bayeux and allow him to return back onto English soil. William the Conqueror died in 1087 and left the crown of England to his second son, William Rufus. The dukedom of Normandy was given to Robert, the eldest son. This was a customary thing to do in the early days of Norman rule. You give your eldest son all of the lands and privileges associated with Normandy and your own Norman lands, whereas your second eldest would be given everything in England because it was considered less important. And although a king is higher than a duke, England was considered not a very pleasant place and filled with not very pleasant people. In the months between William the Conqueror's death in 1087 and the siege of Rochester Castle in the May of 1088, the eldest son to the former king, Robert, decided that he didn't want to just be the new Duke of Normandy, he wanted to be the King of England as well, taking it away from his younger brother, William Rufus. A number of nobles decided that they were going to side with Duke Robert and his claim to the English throne, including that of Odo of Bayeux, the former Earl of Kent. And so Odo decided to use Rochester Castle as one of the various bases of operations for this rebellion against King William Rufus. William Rufus decided to march his armies from the city of London towards the city of Rochester, not only to capture the strategically positioned castle there, but also to capture one of the leading rebels, Odo of Bayeux. But when William Rufus received word that Odo was actually besieging and seized Pevensey Castle along the South English coast, William Rufus diverted his armies towards Pevensey, captured the castle, captured Odo himself, and then made their way back towards the city of Rochester. Despite knowing that Odo had been captured at the siege of Pevensey, those knights and soldiers garrisoned at Rochester Castle refused to surrender to King William's forces. And so siege began. And like with most sieges, King William Rufus decided to basically cut off any supplies getting into the castle itself, and so set up what they call siege castles, little mini fortifications which you could defend effectively, but also use as a focal point for attacking any of your opposing enemies' fortresses or castles. By the summer of 1088, after a very dire situation with disease rife within the garrison at Rochester Castle, the garrison then surrendered. Now, following this first siege of Rochester Castle, the garrison and the fortifications surrounding were pretty much abandoned, and nothing of what really remains of that castle from that early period of history exists today. Largely also because it was made out of timber, and timber doesn't exactly last very long. The lands associated with Rochester Castle were then handed to the Bishop of Rochester, known as Gundulf, spelt with a U, by the way. He had been very good for the city, having reclaimed a lot of the lands in the city of Rochester from the old Earl of Kent Odo, who, as I previously mentioned, put the city in a rather dire financial situation. Gundulf had provided funds for the building of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The main central tower at the cathedral is known as Gundulf's Tower because he was the one that built it. And from 1088 or 89, depending on who you're talking to, he was given permission and ordered, pretty much, to rebuild Rochester Castle, but this time in a more permanent and strong stone structure. Unfortunately, much of what we would presume Gundulf had built in the late 11th century now unfortunately does not exist in today's world. There may be certain fragments which we can allude to that earlier period of Rochester Castle's history, but for the most part, much of what we see of the castle today has been altered, amended, or in some cases rebuilt. Even the main keep, the sort of towered defensive structure within these original stone castle walls, was only converted to its own stone structure in about 1127 after Gundulf's time. It stands at 34 metres tall in that square shape at 21 metres squared. 4 floors, 1 basement floor, 2 main floors, and then the battlements on top. This was never going to be a sort of home for a Grand Duke or an Earl or a Viscount. It was going to be specifically a defensive structure. The first major test of this new stone-walled castle, with its new Kentish ragstone keep, came between the October and the November of 1215, and our second siege of Rochester Castle. Now, 1215 is already a synonymous year within English history, having been the year that the Magna Carta was signed by King John at the behest of his barons, who were upset that he was taking too much power and control for himself. But soon after the signing of this great document, King John decided he was going to refuse and not abide by what the Magna Carta had laid out in its ink. So the First Barons' War ensued, and Rochester Castle was peacefully taken control of by a number of rebels under the leadership of the Lord of Belvoir, William d'Albini. A small royal force arrived at Rochester Castle on the 11th of October, with King John himself arriving just 2 days later, he having been down on the south coast of England rallying up support and buying off some mercenaries. King John's forces brought with them 5 siege engines, notably catapults, which were used to batter down the existing walls that had been built by Gundulf. These catapults were set up just south of Rochester Castle. Here I've drawn a rough image of the layout of Rochester. It's a bit vague, I'll grant you. So obviously here is Rochester Castle with its keep in the corner. Here is the River Medway. There's the bridge that goes towards London and the cathedral here. And there's the town. There's the catapult, and it was set up just south of the castle at a place called Bolney Hill. Now, the siege engines were actually quite effective in battering down those walls that had been built by Gundulf. So the now 150 or so defenders of the castle, including all the knights, the guards, the archers, etc., are all now held up in the keep section of the castle, because this wall, this curtain wall, has been broken and the walls have been penetrated. What King John also did was he dismantled and destroyed the bridge that was going across the River Medway, thereby cutting off any resources that the rebels within the castle, stopping any of the resources getting into the castle for those rebels. But once these walls had been battered and penetrated into by King John's forces, well, the siege came to a bit of a grinding halt. They were still using those catapults to try and batter through the walls, and of course King John's men were still desperately trying to get into the castle keep, but they weren't being very successful. It was coming to a grinding halt, as I say. That was until the 25th of November 1215, some 5 weeks or so after the siege began. This is when King John basically asked his sappers to undermine the southeastern tower of the castle keep. Now, what it means to undermine a castle is as I will demonstrate. Here is a very rough image of a castle keep, and here are the wooden foundations, the wooden timber props that keep up the stability of this castle. What you're basically doing, as the name sort of suggests, you basically dig a tunnel underneath the castle to where these foundations are, and then you set light to them. King John supposedly requested the fat of 40 pigs be used to undermine the southeastern tower of the castle keep. Undermining successful, the entire south-facing side of the castle keep collapsed and was destroyed. But there is one more defence that the rebels had on offer. You see, when the castle keep was built, there was this dividing crosswall that was also included in its construction. So when the southeastern side of the castle keep was destroyed, all of the rebels then just made their way to the other side of the castle instead, because this particular section, the west, south, west and northwest sections, were all still standing. But despite having this extra layer of defence to defend from, the rebels were in a desperate position for the last 5 days of the siege. For their water and food resources were dwindling and becoming very scarce, to the point that certain individuals started to eat their own horses. On the 30th of November 1215, the remaining rebels and defenders of Rochester Castle surrendered to King John. Now, customarily, it would be a case that King John would execute all the rebels, and especially the Lord of Belvoir, William d'Albini, who had led this charge and this defence against King John's siege. But there is a suggestion, albeit a debatable one, that actually King John showed a little bit of mercy, or was convinced to show mercy. In fact, only cutting off the hands and feet of those rebels that had been involved in the siege of Rochester. Just under a year after this siege of Rochester Castle by the forces of King John, the rebellious barons under their new leader and supposed King of England, Prince Louis of France, decided to besiege Rochester Castle and take it back from royal control. But there's no real suggestion as to when it happened, what happened, and in all honesty, whether it actually happened at all. Under royal control, in the 1220s, Henry III ordered the rebuilding of the castle keep section that had been destroyed in that previous siege of 1215. But instead of rebuilding it into the same old square keep that we're used to seeing, he decided to make it a more rounded shape, a more rounded keep. That is because a round keep has more surface area and therefore less structural weak points from which to exploit. A square keep has, of course, 4 corners, less surface area and exploitable weaknesses, like what happened in 1215. Henry III also bolstered a lot of the internal defences of the castle, taking the large expansive bailey that surrounds the castle keep and splitting it in 2, thereby putting in a new wall and a new gatehouse from which to defend from. Should an attacking force get in to the first portion of that bailey, past the curtain wall, they still had to get past the secondary wall, the secondary gatehouse, in order to get to the keep section. And even then, as I mentioned, the keep was now a new, structurally more rounded building. These new defences built by Henry III were put to the test in 1264 with our 3rd siege of Rochester Castle. The royalist force led by the castle constables Roger de Leybourne and John de Warenne, were attacked between the 17th and the 26th of April 1264 by the forces of Simon de Montfort and his second-in-command Gilbert de Clare. Now, just to provide a little bit of context, Simon de Montfort rebelled against the authority of Henry III, King of England, between 1264 and 1267. Throughout the course of this Second Barons' War, Simon de Montfort overthrew the power of the king, set up a protectorate, a series of councillors led by the leading barons of England to run the English nation, then eventually lost his power and was killed at the Battle of Evesham in 1267, restoring the power and the kingship of Henry III. So Rochester Castle is at the very beginnings of this Barons' War, in the April of 1264. On the first day of the siege, de Clare arrived at the south side of Rochester Castle, on Bolney Hill, like what King John had done in 1215. He decided that he was going to negotiate with de Montfort's forces, who were trying to traverse the River Medway and the bridge that crosses it. But on both sides of this two-pronged attack, there was a lot of stiff resistance, especially from de Montfort's side, with the difficulty of actually crossing the river itself. But on the second day of the siege, de Montfort decided to let loose a fire ship, which misted and smoked out a lot of the prying eyes of the royalist constables in the castle defences. Now, there is the suggestion that de Montfort was trying to burn down the bridge that crossed the River Medway, whilst his own forces travelled by water at a lesser strong point further upstream. But whether this is true, it was a distraction nonetheless, because de Montfort was able to cross the River Medway and continue the siege of the castle in full effect with two commanding officers. And with this two-pronged attack, by the third day of the siege, what they call the outer garrison of the castle walls was pounded, demolished, and captured. But of course, with the new design that Henry III had put in the 1220s, there was now a new central gatehouse and a central wall that divided the two sections of the castle. So the keep and the inner garrison, as it is now being called, was still very much protected from the forces of de Montfort and de Clare. Being Easter Sunday on our fourth day of castle siege, both attacking and defending forces of Rochester Castle decided to take a day of rest and do the usual things that a medieval individual would do on Easter Sunday. Although what de Clare or de Montfort would be doing on Easter Sunday is rather unclear, because actually de Montfort had ransacked the cathedral and pretty much burned a lot of the portions of the town on his second day of sieging. But when it came to the fifth day of the siege, Easter Monday, the fight was back on, because the forces of de Clare and de Montfort set up siege engines in order to catapult and break down these defensive walls of Rochester Castle's keep. Yet again, this did not work. These castle walls remained too strong for these catapults to break through. On the ninth day of the siege, discussions were made between de Clare and de Montfort about whether they should undermine the castle keep, like, again, what King John had done 50 years previous. But before this plan could be implemented, on the 26th of April, the 10th day of the castle siege, both de Clare and de Montfort were made aware that a royal force headed by King Henry III himself and the young Prince Edward was coming to relieve Rochester Castle. So, cutting their losses, de Clare and de Montfort retreated, and the castle siege concluded. The damage that had been sustained by Rochester Castle during this third and final siege in 1264 was not sort of rebuilt or rectified until the following century, under the reigns of Edward III and his successor Richard II, wherein a new fortified bastion was built overlooking the River Medway and the bridge that crosses it, a new tower around the curtain wall, and certain sections of the actual curtain wall itself were rebuilt, having stood there since the time of Gundulf in the late 11th century, and generally just sort of structural integrity to the castle itself. But by the end of the following century, during the reigns of Henry VII and Henry VIII, the castle had been largely neglected. Certain famous faces can be found in the castle's record as either having visited or being kept prisoner in Rochester Castle, but as for a defensive bastion, well, it was left rather neglected. The castle was actually opened up to the public as a sort of pleasure grounds from the year 1870, causing the unfortunate demolition of the old medieval drawbridge and the old gatehouse used to get inside. Also, the moat that had once surrounded the castle itself was also largely filled in. Now it's just a sort of grassy slope instead. The City Council purchased Rochester Castle for a grand total of £6,572, from which they opened it up for public use even further, and of course now today the Castle Keep is an English heritage monument which for a small fee you can go and visit. And there we have it, Rochester Castle's long history and its 3 significant sieges boiled down into oh so many minutes. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you can come back again and see more videos like this, and if you haven't already seen the back catalogue, please feel free to do that as well. But in the meantime, see you later. And have a good day, actually. Yeah, just generally have a good day. Bye.